The morning Genevieve Dalton collapsed in the dusty street outside the Platteville boarding house. The town doctor gave her 3 months to live. Maybe less if she did not start eating proper meals. She was 22 years old, thin as a willow branch, and every breath seemed to cost her more effort than the last. The other boarders had whispered about her condition for weeks, watching her push food around her plate at supper, taking tiny bites that a sparrow would have found insufficient. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the establishment with an iron fist and a surprisingly soft heart, wrung her hands and tried everything from beef stew to apple pie. But nothing seemed to help the frail young woman who had arrived in Colorado Territory 6 months prior. Genevieve had come west after her parents died of cholera back in Philadelphia, leaving her with nothing but debts and memories. A distant cousin had promised her work as a seamstress in Denver, but when she arrived, the cousin had moved on without leaving word. Stranded and desperate, she had taken what little money remained and made her way to Platteville, a mining town 40 miles northeast of Denver, where she found employment mending clothes and taking in laundry. The work was honest but exhausting, and between the altitude, the dry air, and her inability to afford proper meals, her health had deteriorated rapidly. The boarding house dining room buzzed with conversation that September evening in 1876 as the residents gathered around the long oak table. Mr. Peterson, a railway clerk with a prominent belly, helped himself to a generous portion of roasted chicken. Miss Martha, the schoolteacher, passed the potatoes with a practiced smile. Young Timothy, barely 18 and working at the general store, grabbed 3 biscuits before anyone could stop him. At the far end of the table, Genevieve sat with her hands folded in her lap, her plate empty. "She eats like a bird," Mr. Peterson remarked, not unkindly, as he watched Mrs. Henderson place a modest chicken leg on Genevieve's plate. Smaller than a bird, really, more like an insect. The boarders chuckled nervously. They had grown fond of the quiet young woman with the pale complexion and sad gray eyes. But her refusal to eat properly concerned them all. Genevieve managed a weak smile and picked up her fork, determined to make an effort. She cut a small piece of meat and lifted it to her lips, chewing slowly. The effort of swallowing seemed monumental, but she persisted, aware of all the eyes watching her. The door to the dining room swung open with enough force to rattle the pictures on the wall. Every head turned to see who had entered with such authority. The man who stepped through the doorway had to duck slightly to clear the frame. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly brushed both sides of the doorframe. His hair, dark brown and streaked with sun-bleached highlights, hung past his collar, wild and untamed as the mountains he called home. His beard was full but neatly trimmed, and his eyes were the color of a stormy sky. He wore buckskins that had seen hard use, and a knife hung from his belt in a worn leather sheath. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "I am looking for lodging for the night. My name is Pierce Malone. I have coin to pay." Mrs. Henderson rose from her seat, flustered by the imposing presence of the mountain man. "Mr. Malone, of course. We have 1 room available. You are welcome to join us for supper first." Pierce removed his hat, revealing more of that wild hair, and nodded his thanks. His gaze swept the table, taking in each resident with the assessing look of a man accustomed to judging character quickly. When his eyes landed on Genevieve, they stopped. He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before taking the empty seat directly across from her. Mrs. Henderson hurried to fetch another plate, while the other boarders made awkward small talk with the newcomer. Pierce answered their questions with brevity that bordered on curtness. Yes, he trapped in the mountains. Yes, he came to town twice a year to sell pelts and buy supplies. No, he did not miss civilization. His attention kept drifting back to Genevieve, who had managed to eat perhaps 2 bites of chicken before setting down her fork, looking exhausted by the effort. When Mrs. Henderson returned with Pierce's plate, she had piled it high with chicken, potatoes, biscuits, and gravy. The mountain man thanked her and began eating with the appetite of someone who had spent the day hiking down from high country. He ate efficiently, without waste or pretense. But halfway through his meal, he paused. He looked at the chicken leg remaining on his plate, then at Genevieve's barely touched food. Without a word, he used his knife to slice off the plumpest, most tender portion of the breast meat, the piece that glistened with juice and would melt in the mouth. He reached across the table and transferred it to her plate. The dining room fell silent. Every boarder stopped eating to witness this unprecedented gesture. Genevieve stared at the meat on her plate, then up at Pierce, her gray eyes wide with surprise. "That is the best cut," Pierce said simply. "You need it more than I do." "I cannot accept," Genevieve whispered, her voice barely audible. "You paid for your meal." "And I will eat my fill regardless," Pierce replied. He gestured at her plate with his fork. "Eat, you are wasting away." It was not a request, but a command, delivered with the absolute confidence of a man unaccustomed to being disobeyed. Yet there was no cruelty in his tone, only a firm insistence that bordered on concern. Genevieve felt something stir in her chest, a warmth she had not experienced in months. She picked up her fork and cut a small piece of the tender meat. When she tasted it, the flavor exploded on her tongue, rich and savory. She took another bite, then another, until she had consumed the entire portion Pierce had given her. The mountain man nodded in satisfaction and returned to his own meal. The other boarders gradually resumed their conversations. But the atmosphere had shifted. They had witnessed something they could not quite name, a connection forged across a dining table between two souls who seemed to recognize something essential in one another. After supper, the boarders dispersed to their various evening activities. Mr. Peterson retired to smoke his pipe on the porch. Miss Martha settled in the parlor with her needlework. Timothy headed to the saloon despite Mrs. Henderson's disapproving glare. Genevieve helped clear the table, though Mrs. Henderson tried to shoo her away to rest. "You ate more tonight than you have all week," the landlady said, her voice warm with approval. "That mountain man did you a service." "He was very kind," Genevieve agreed softly. She carried a stack of plates to the kitchen, moving slowly to conserve her limited energy. When she returned to the dining room for another load, she found Pierce still seated at the table, whittling a piece of wood with his hunting knife. The shavings fell onto an old newspaper he had spread across the tablecloth. "You should not be working," he said without looking up from his carving. "You need rest." "I earn my keep by helping where I can," Genevieve replied. She reached for more dishes, but her hand trembled with fatigue. Before she could grasp the serving bowl, Pierce stood and moved around the table with surprising speed for such a large man. He gently but firmly took her elbow. "Sit," he commanded, guiding her into a chair. "I will help Mrs. Henderson with the cleaning." "That is not necessary," Genevieve protested, though her body sagged with relief at being allowed to rest. "It is necessary," Pierce said. He looked down at her with those storm-gray eyes, and she saw something in them that made her breath catch. Not pity exactly, but a fierce determination that seemed wholly focused on her well-being. "How long have you been ill?" "I am not ill," she said automatically, the lie she had told herself and others for months. "I am simply adjusting to the altitude." Pierce crouched beside her chair so they were eye to eye. Up close, she could see the weathering on his face, the lines carved by sun and wind and hardship. She could smell pine and wood smoke on his clothes, the scent of the wilderness he called home. His presence was overwhelming, masculine and powerful in a way that should have frightened her, but instead made her feel oddly safe. "Do not lie to me," he said quietly, "and do not lie to yourself. You are starving to death, and everyone in this house can see it except you." Tears sprang to Genevieve's eyes. She had become so practiced at denial, at putting on a brave face, that having someone confront the truth so directly cracked something open inside her. "I cannot seem to eat," she whispered. "Everything makes me feel ill. I try, but my stomach refuses." "Since when?" "Since my parents died. Since I came west." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. "The doctor says my grief has affected my digestion. He says if I do not improve, I will not survive the winter." Pierce was quiet for a long moment, studying her face as though memorizing every detail. Then he stood and offered her his hand. "Come with me." "Where?" "For a walk. The evening air will do you good." Genevieve knew she should refuse. It was improper to walk alone with a man she had just met, particularly one as rugged and unconventional as Pierce Malone. But something in his manner, some unspoken promise of protection, made her place her small hand in his large calloused palm. He helped her to her feet and led her through the house to the front door. The September evening was cool and pleasant, the oppressive heat of summer giving way to the crisp promise of autumn. Stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, brighter than they had ever been in Philadelphia. Pierce offered Genevieve his arm, and after a moment's hesitation, she accepted. They walked slowly down the wooden sidewalk, past the general store and the blacksmith shop, both closed for the night. "Tell me about your parents," Pierce said. The request surprised her. Most people avoided the topic of death, particularly recent death. But she found herself wanting to talk about them, to keep their memory alive through words. "My father was a bookkeeper. My mother taught piano. They were good people, hardworking and kind. When the cholera came through Philadelphia last year, they tried to help their neighbors. They both fell ill within days of each other. You nursed them. I tried. But there was nothing anyone could do. They died within a week, first my mother, then my father." She paused, the memory still raw despite the passage of months. "I could not save them. I could not even afford proper headstones." Pierce said nothing, but his hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, warm and solid. They walked in silence for a while, passing the church and the schoolhouse. The town was quiet. Most residents already home for the evening. "I lost my family too," Pierce said eventually. "Parents, 2 brothers, a sister. Diphtheria when I was 19. I was the only one who survived." Genevieve looked up at him, seeing him anew. "I am so sorry. It was 12 years ago. The pain fades, but it never disappears entirely." He glanced down at her. "I stopped eating after they died. Could not bring myself to take sustenance when they could not. I grew weak, nearly died myself. My uncle, a trapper, came to check on the family and found me half-starved. He dragged me into the mountains and made me work so hard I had no choice but to eat or collapse. Saved my life by refusing to let me give up. Is that why you gave me the best cut of meat tonight?" "Partly. Also because I could see you needed it, and the others at that table did not." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Genevieve, I know we just met. I know I have no right to speak plainly to you. But I am going to, anyway, because I have never been good at dancing around the truth." Her heart began to beat faster. What is it? You are dying. Not from illness, but from giving up. You have suffered a terrible loss, and you have let it consume you. But your parents would not want you to follow them into death. They would want you to live, to thrive, to find joy again. You do not know what they would want, she said, but without heat. The truth of his words resonated in her chest. No, I do not. But I know what my family would have wanted for me, and I know what any parent would want for their child. He reached up and gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, the gesture surprisingly tender from such a rough man. You have to choose to live, Genevieve. No one can make that choice for you. She stared up at him, this stranger who somehow understood her better than people she had known for months. I do not know if I can. Yes, you can. You proved it tonight when you ate the meat I gave you. You can do it again tomorrow and the day after, until eating becomes natural again. His hand moved to cup her cheek, and she leaned into the touch without thinking. I will help you. I will make sure you get the best cut every single meal until you are strong again. Why would you do that? You do not know me. Pierce smiled, the expression transforming his stern face into something breathtaking. I do not know. But the moment I saw you sitting at that table, looking so fragile and lost, something in me decided you were worth fighting for. Call it instinct. Call it fate. Call it whatever you like. I am not leaving Platteville until I know you will survive. Tears spilled down Genevieve's cheeks, but for the first time in months, they were not solely tears of grief. Mixed with the sorrow was something else, something that felt almost like hope. I do not understand you, Pierce Malone. You will, he promised. Given time, you will. They walked back to the boarding house slowly, Genevieve leaning more heavily on Pierce's arm than she had on the way out. She was exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion, the kind that came from emotional release rather than despair. When they reached the front porch, Pierce walked her to the door, but did not attempt to enter. Get some rest, he said. Tomorrow morning, you will eat breakfast, a full breakfast, even if I have to sit beside you and coax every bite into your mouth. That would be highly improper, Genevieve said, but she was smiling slightly. I have never been particularly concerned with propriety. Good night, Genevieve Dalton. Good night, Pierce Malone. She slipped inside and climbed the stairs to her small room on the second floor. For the first time since arriving in Platteville, she did not immediately collapse onto her bed in exhaustion. Instead, she stood at the window, looking out at the mountains visible in the distance, dark silhouettes against the star-filled sky. Somewhere up there, Pierce had a cabin, a life, a world entirely separate from civilization. Yet he had come down from those heights just in time to find her, to speak the words she needed to hear. She pressed her hand to her stomach, which felt fuller than it had in months. The meat Pierce had given her had actually stayed down, not making her nauseated the way food usually did. Perhaps it was the quality of the cut, or perhaps it was something about the way he had given it to her, with such certainty that she needed it. Whatever the reason, she felt a tiny spark of hunger stirring, a desire for more that she had not experienced since her parents' death. That night, Genevieve slept more soundly than she had in months, untroubled by the nightmares that usually plagued her dreams. Morning came too soon and too bright. Genevieve woke to sunlight streaming through her window and the sound of Mrs. Henderson calling the boarders to breakfast. She dressed slowly, choosing her least worn dress, a simple gray cotton that hung loose on her diminished frame. When she looked in the small mirror above her washstand, she barely recognized herself. Her cheekbones were too prominent, her eyes too large in her thin face. She looked like a ghost, she realized, someone already halfway to the grave. But today would be different. Pierce had said he would help her, and she found herself wanting to try, if only to see if the strange mountain man kept his promises. The dining room was already full when she descended. The usual boarders occupied their regular seats, with one notable addition. Pierce sat in the same chair he had occupied the previous evening, directly across from where Genevieve usually sat. He looked freshly washed, his hair damp and slicked back, his beard trimmed. He had changed into clean clothes, though they were still buckskins, marking him as a man of the wilderness despite his temporary sojourn in town. "Good morning, Miss Dalton," he said when she entered, his voice carrying across the room. The other boarders looked up, smiling at her with various degrees of curiosity and approval. "Good morning, Mr. Malone," she replied, moving to her seat. Her place at the table had already been set with a plate piled higher than usual. Scrambled eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, and a thick slice of bread with butter melting into its surface. Her stomach clenched at the sight of so much food. "I can't eat all of this," she whispered as she sat down. "You will eat what you can," Pierce said calmly. He had his own substantial breakfast before him. "Start with the eggs. They are easiest on the stomach." Genevieve picked up her fork with a trembling hand. The other boarders were watching, though they tried to pretend otherwise. Mr. Peterson hid behind his newspaper. Miss Martha suddenly became very interested in her coffee. Young Timothy, bless him, was too focused on his own food to notice the drama unfolding. She took a small bite of eggs. They were fluffy and well-seasoned, courtesy of Mrs. Henderson's skilled cooking. She swallowed, waited for the familiar nausea to rise. It did not come. Encouraged, she took another bite, then another. Across the table, Pierce ate his own breakfast, but kept glancing up to monitor her progress. When Genevieve had consumed roughly half her eggs, she reached for her coffee, needing a break. Pierce immediately moved. With his fork, he speared 3 strips of bacon from his own plate and transferred them to hers. "The bacon is particularly good this morning," he said. "Smoked perfectly." "You keep giving me your food," Genevieve protested weakly. "I have plenty. You need it more." He took a large bite of his own potatoes, watching her expectantly. Something about his steady gaze, those storm-gray eyes fixed on her with such intensity, made Genevieve want to please him. She picked up a strip of bacon and bit into it. The salty, smoky flavor was divine. She ate all 3 strips he had given her, then finished the rest of her eggs. By the time she set down her fork, she had consumed more food than she typically managed in an entire day. "Well done," Pierce said quietly, and the approval in his voice made her feel warm all over. "I feel quite full," she admitted. "Good. That is how you should feel after a meal." He finished his own breakfast with efficient bites, then stood. "I have business at the trading post today. Would you walk with me?" Genevieve knew she should decline. She had laundry to tend to, mending to complete. But the thought of spending more time in Pierce's presence was too appealing to resist. "I would like that." They left the boarding house together, stepping into a morning that was clear and bright. The main street of Platteville was already busy with activity. Wagons rolled past, their wheels kicking up dust. A group of miners trudged toward the hills, pickaxes over their shoulders. Women hurried between shops, baskets on their arms. The general store had just opened, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery next door. Pierce shortened his naturally long stride to match Genevieve's slower pace. She was aware of the glances they drew, the way people noticed the tall mountain man walking beside the frail young seamstress. She could almost hear the gossip starting, the speculation about what such an unlikely pair might be to each other. "Do you care what people think?" Pierce asked, as though reading her thoughts. "I suppose I should not," Genevieve said. "But I do. I have always been concerned with propriety, with maintaining appearances. My mother taught me that a woman's reputation was her most valuable possession." "Your mother was wrong." Pierce spoke bluntly, without apology. "A woman's most valuable possession is her life, her health, her happiness. Everything else is secondary." "That is easy for you to say. You are a man, and one who lives outside of society. You do not have to worry about what people whisper." "You are right. I do not worry about it, because worrying accomplishes nothing. People will talk regardless of what you do. You might as well do what makes you happy and let them waste their breath." They reached the trading post, a large wooden building near the edge of town. Inside, it smelled of leather, tobacco, and the indefinable scent of goods from far away. The proprietor, a grizzled man named Sam Tucker, looked up from his counter when they entered. "Pierce Malone," he said, his weathered face breaking into a grin. "Heard you were in town. Got your pelts with you?" "In my wagon, around back. Good quality this season. Beaver, fox, and a few wolf." "I will take a look." Sam's gaze drifted to Genevieve, and his eyebrows rose. "Who is your companion?" "Miss Genevieve Dalton. She is boarding at the Henderson place." "Pleased to meet you, miss." Sam tipped his hat to her, then returned his attention to Pierce. "Let us go inspect those pelts." The two men headed toward the back of the store, leaving Genevieve to browse. She wandered between the shelves, examining goods she could not afford, bolts of fabric in colors she could only dream of using, ribbons and lace, a beautiful china teacup painted with roses. Her seamstress wages barely covered her board and the cost of thread for her work. There was nothing left for luxuries. She was admiring a length of blue calico when Pierce returned. He carried a small leather pouch that clinked with coin, payment for his pelts. Sam followed behind, looking satisfied with whatever deal they had struck. "Do you like that fabric?" Pierce asked, nodding toward the calico. "It is very pretty," Genevieve said wistfully. "I was just imagining what it might look like, made into a dress." Pierce plucked the bolt from the shelf and carried it to the counter. "I will take enough for a dress," he told Sam, "and whatever notions she needs to sew it." "No," Genevieve gasped. "Pierce, that is too much. I cannot accept." "You can, and you will." He looked at her, his expression brooking no argument. "Consider it payment for the pleasure of your company. Besides, you need a dress that fits properly. The one you are wearing hangs on you like a sack." Heat flooded Genevieve's cheeks, embarrassment warring with gratitude. "I lost weight. I have not had the funds to alter my clothes. Now you will have a new dress." Pierce turned to Sam. "What else does she need? Thread? Needles?" "Pierce, please." Genevieve tried again, mortified by his generosity. "Let the man buy you something nice," Sam said with a chuckle. "Lord knows he can afford it, and you look like you could use some cheering up." Defeated but oddly pleased, Genevieve selected thread to match the calico, some white lace for trim, and new needles since her current ones were wearing thin. Pierce paid for everything without blinking, then had Sam wrap the purchases in brown paper. He tucked the bundle under his arm as they exited the trading post. "You should not have done that," Genevieve said as they walked back toward the center of town. "Why not? I wanted to. We barely know each other. It is not proper for you to buy me gifts." Pierce stopped walking and turned to face her. They stood in the middle of the wooden sidewalk, forcing other pedestrians to move around them. "Genevieve, I am going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. I do not care about proper. I do not care what the gossips in this town think or say. What I care about is seeing you healthy and happy. If buying you fabric for a dress helps accomplish that, then I consider it money well spent. But why? Why do you care so much about me?" He studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. "I wish I could explain it in a way that made sense. All I know is that when I saw you yesterday, something in me recognized something in you. Like calls to like, I suppose. We have both known loss. We have both stood at the edge of giving up. I survived because someone cared enough to pull me back from that edge. Now I am doing the same for you. And after I am well, what then? You will return to your mountains and I will never see you again?" The words came out more plaintive than she intended, revealing the attachment that was already forming in her heart. Pierce's expression softened, and he reached out to tuck a strand of her hair behind her ear, the gesture becoming familiar between them. "I do not know what happens after," he admitted, "but I suspect we will figure it out together, if you are willing." "Willing to what?" "To see where this leads, to let me court you properly, or as properly as a mountain man knows how." Genevieve's breath caught. "You want to court me?" "I do. I realize it is fast, perhaps too fast. But I am not a man who wastes time when I know what I want. And I want to know you better, Genevieve Dalton. I want to help you heal. I want to see you smile without sadness behind it. I want to hear you laugh. I want to watch you become strong again." He paused, then added quietly, "And I want you to want those things too." She should refuse. It was too sudden, too unconventional. But looking into Pierce's eyes, seeing the sincerity there, feeling the strength of his presence and the genuine care in his manner, Genevieve found she could not say no. She did not want to say no. "I would like that," she whispered. "I would like to see where this leads." Pierce's smile was brilliant, transforming his rugged features. "Then it is settled. I will stay in Platteville as long as necessary. I will take odd jobs to pay my board, and every meal I will make sure you get the best cut, until you no longer need my help." They walked back to the boarding house, hand in hand, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed them. Mrs. Henderson was sweeping the front porch when they arrived, and her eyes widened at the sight of their joined hands. "Mr. Malone, Miss Dalton," she said carefully, "did you have a pleasant walk?" "Very pleasant," Pierce replied. "Mrs. Henderson, I would like to extend my stay at your establishment. I will need the room for at least a month, possibly longer." Of course. The landlady's face brightened. "We are happy to have you. Will you be joining us for luncheon as well?" "I will be joining you for all meals," Pierce said firmly. "I have appointed myself Miss Dalton's dining companion. I trust that is acceptable." Mrs. Henderson glanced between them, and understanding dawned in her eyes. A smile tugged at her lips. "It is more than acceptable, Mr. Malone. I think it is wonderful." The next few weeks established a pattern that became as natural as breathing. Pierce found work at the lumber mill outside town, his considerable strength making him valuable for the heavy labor. He left early each morning, but always returned in time to escort Genevieve to the dining room for supper. True to his word, he made certain she received the best portions at every meal. When Mrs. Henderson served chicken, Pierce gave Genevieve the tenderest breast meat. When there was beef, she received the most marbled, flavorful slices. He gave her the warmest bread, the freshest vegetables, the creamiest butter. At first, the other boarders found this behavior unusual, but they quickly adjusted. Mr. Peterson even began imitating Pierce, offering extra portions to Miss Martha, who blushed and tittered with pleasure. Young Timothy, observing the romance blossoming before his eyes, took to sighing dramatically and declaring he would never find love in such a hardscrabble town. More importantly, Genevieve began to improve. The constant nourishment, combined with Pierce's unwavering attention and care, awakened her body's natural appetite. Where once she had to force down every bite, she now found herself actually hungry at mealtimes. Her clothes began to fit better. Color returned to her cheeks. The shadows under her eyes faded. Dr. Marsh, making his weekly rounds, expressed amazement at her transformation. "Whatever you are doing, Miss Dalton, keep doing it," he said, listening to her heartbeat with his stethoscope. "Your pulse is stronger. Your lungs sound clearer. I dare say you might actually survive the winter after all." "I have had help," Genevieve admitted, glancing at Pierce, who waited outside the examination room with the patience of a man who had learned to wait out winter storms in the high country. "From Mr. Malone, I presume?" The doctor chuckled. "The whole town is talking about how he guards you at meals like a wolf protecting its mate. Some find it strange, but I think it is exactly what you needed. Sometimes healing requires more than medicine. It requires someone to care whether you live or die." After her examination, Pierce walked Genevieve back to the boarding house. It was early October now, and the aspens in the mountains had turned gold, brilliant against the dark green pines. The air carried a crisp edge that promised winter would come early to the high country. "I should return to my cabin soon," Pierce said as they walked, "before the first heavy snow. I need to check my trap lines, lay in supplies for winter." Genevieve's heart sank. She had known this moment would come, but she had not prepared herself for the hollow feeling that accompanied it. "How long will you be gone?" "Most of the winter. I do not usually come to town between October and April." "6 months," she whispered. Pierce stopped walking and turned her to face him. They stood beneath a cottonwood tree, its leaves rustling overhead in the breeze. "Come with me." Genevieve stared at him, certain she had misheard. "What?" "Come with me to the mountains. Spend the winter at my cabin." He took both her hands in his grip warm and strong. "I know it is asking a lot. I know it is not conventional. But Genevieve, these past weeks with you have been the best of my life. I do not want to spend 6 months without you. I do not think I can. Pierce, I cannot just run off to the mountains with you. It would ruin my reputation entirely. People would think we were married or worse." "Then marry me." The words hung in the air between them, so simple and yet so monumental. Genevieve's hands trembled in his grasp. "What did you say?" "Marry me," Pierce repeated, his voice steady and sure. "I know it has only been a few weeks. I know by conventional standards we should court for at least a year. But I am not a conventional man, and this is not a conventional situation. I love you, Genevieve. I loved you from the moment I saw you at that dining table, looking so lost and fragile. I love your quiet strength, your determination to heal, your gentle spirit. I want to spend my life making sure you always get the best cut. I want to watch you grow strong and healthy. I want to see you thrive. Marry me and come home with me to the mountains." Tears streamed down Genevieve's face, but they were not tears of sorrow. "I love you too," she said, the truth of it ringing through her entire being. "I did not think I would ever feel this way about anyone. I thought I would spend the rest of my short life alone and grieving. But you changed everything. You gave me a reason to live again. Yes, Pierce Malone, I will marry you." He kissed her then, there beneath the cottonwood tree, with the whole town potentially watching. It was not a chaste kiss, but a claiming, possessive, and passionate. A promise of everything they would share together. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Genevieve felt more alive than she had since before her parents died. "When?" she asked. "As soon as possible. Tomorrow, if the preacher is available." "Tomorrow," she agreed, dizzy with the speed of it all, but certain in her heart that this was right. They married 2 days later in the small white church at the edge of Platteville. Mrs. Henderson stood as witness, crying happy tears into her handkerchief. Mr. Peterson gave Genevieve away, since she had no family to perform the duty. Miss Martha played the church's small organ, filling the space with music. Even young Timothy attended, scrubbed clean and wearing his Sunday best. Genevieve wore a dress hastily constructed from the blue calico Pierce had bought her, the lace trim at the collar and cuffs gleaming white against the blue fabric. She had worked late into the night for 2 nights running to finish it, her fingers flying over the stitches with a speed born of necessity and excitement. Pierce wore new trousers and a white shirt, both purchased at the general store for the occasion, though he refused to part with his worn boots, claiming they were the only footwear he trusted. Reverend Walsh performed the ceremony with warmth and humor, clearly delighted to be marrying a couple so obviously in love. When Pierce said, "I do," his voice rang out strong and clear, filling every corner of the little church. When Genevieve spoke the same words, her voice was softer, but no less certain. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Walsh said with a smile. Pierce cupped Genevieve's face in his large hands and kissed her with a tenderness that made her melt against him. The small congregation applauded, and Mrs. Henderson sobbed louder into her handkerchief. After the ceremony, Mrs. Henderson hosted a simple wedding supper at the boarding house. She had outdone herself, preparing a feast of roasted beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, apple pie, and cider. The dining room was decorated with autumn leaves and wildflowers that Miss Martha had gathered. All the boarders attended, along with several townspeople who had grown fond of the couple. Pierce sat beside his new wife, their chairs pulled close together so their shoulders touched. When Mrs. Henderson served the beef, Pierce carefully selected the most tender, flavorful slice and placed it on Genevieve's plate, just as he had done at every meal since they met. The gesture brought fresh tears to several of the women present, who whispered about how romantic it was. Genevieve ate heartily, her appetite now fully restored. She laughed at Mr. Peterson's jokes, thanked Miss Martha for her musical contribution, and accepted Timothy's awkward congratulations with grace. But her attention never strayed far from Pierce, whose presence beside her felt like the most natural thing in the world. As the evening wore on and the sun set beyond the mountains, Pierce leaned close to whisper in her ear, "Are you ready to go home, Mrs. Malone?" The name sent a thrill through her. "Yes, Mr. Malone, I am ready." They left the boarding house amid a shower of rice and good wishes. Pierce had prepared his wagon for the journey, stocking it with supplies to see them through the winter. Genevieve's few possessions had already been packed, including her sewing supplies, extra fabric, and the books she had inherited from her mother. Pierce helped her onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her and took the reins. "Goodbye," Genevieve called to the assembled well-wishers. "Thank you for everything." "Take care of her," Mrs. Henderson shouted at Pierce. "With my life," he promised, and snapped the reins. The horses moved forward, pulling the wagon toward the mountains that rose dark and majestic in the distance. The journey took most of the next day. They followed a rough trail that climbed steadily upward, leaving civilization behind. The air grew thinner and cooler as they ascended. Aspens lined the path, their golden leaves shimmering in the breeze. Higher up, they gave way to pines and firs, their scent sharp and clean. They saw deer grazing in mountain meadows, eagles soaring overhead, and once, far in the distance, a bear ambling along a ridge. Pierce pointed out landmarks as they traveled, sharing stories of his life in the mountains. He told her about the winter he had been snowed in for 3 weeks straight, about the time he had tracked a wounded elk for 2 days to put it out of its misery, about the morning he had woken to find a family of foxes playing outside his cabin. Genevieve listened with fascination, this world so different from everything she had known in Philadelphia. There, life had been measured by social calls and concert schedules, by the proper time to serve tea and the correct length of visiting hours. Here, life was measured by seasons and weather, by the movements of animals and the quality of water in the streams. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Pierce guided the wagon off the main trail onto an even narrower path. Trees closed in on both sides, their branches forming a canopy overhead. Just when Genevieve began to wonder if they would reach the cabin before dark, the path opened into a clearing. The cabin stood in the center of the clearing, built from pine logs chinked with clay. It was larger than she had expected, with a sturdy roof, real glass windows, and a stone chimney. A covered porch ran along the front, and behind the cabin, she could see a small barn for the horses and wagon. Mountains rose on all sides, creating a natural amphitheater that felt both protective and isolated. "Welcome home," Pierce said softly. Home. The word resonated in Genevieve's chest. She had not had a true home since her parents died, just temporary lodgings in places where she never quite belonged. But looking at this cabin in the wilderness, with Pierce beside her, she felt something settle in her soul. Pierce helped her down from the wagon and led her to the cabin door. "There is a tradition," he said, "about carrying the bride over the threshold." Before Genevieve could respond, he swept her into his arms as though she weighed nothing. She laughed and wrapped her arms around his neck as he carried her into the cabin. He did not set her down immediately, but held her close, his face buried in her hair. "I am going to make you happy," he murmured. "I swear it." "You already have," she replied. He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Genevieve felt heat bloom through her entire body. When he finally set her on her feet, she was flushed and breathless. The cabin's interior was simple but comfortable. The main room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall. A table and chairs occupied the center of the room. Shelves lined the walls, holding dishes, cooking supplies, and Pierce's small collection of books. A ladder led to a sleeping loft above. Everything was clean and orderly, the home of a man who took care of his possessions. "It is wonderful," Genevieve said, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "It is not fancy," Pierce said, sounding almost apologetic. "Not what you are accustomed to. It is perfect." She moved to the window and looked out at the mountains. "I had no idea the world could be so beautiful." Pierce came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her back against his chest. "I am glad you think so. You are going to be looking at that view for a long time." They spent the evening unloading the wagon. Pierce brought in supplies, while Genevieve began making the cabin feel like theirs rather than just his. She unpacked her few possessions, adding her books to his shelves, placing her mother's jewelry box on the small dresser in the loft. She found linens and made up the bed with fresh sheets, her hands trembling slightly as she thought about the night ahead. Pierce built a fire in the fireplace and prepared supper. A simple meal of salt pork, beans, and the last of Mrs. Henderson's bread. They ate sitting close together at the table, their knees touching. The food was not fancy, but Genevieve ate every bite, her appetite strong and her stomach no longer protesting. "You have come so far," Pierce said, watching her clean her plate. "When I first saw you, I was not certain you would survive the month. I would not have without you." Genevieve reached across the table and took his hand. "You saved my life, Pierce." "We saved each other," he corrected. "I did not realize how lonely I was until I met you, how empty my life had become. I had convinced myself I preferred solitude, that I did not need anyone. But I was wrong. I needed you." After supper, they sat before the fire. Genevieve in Pierce's lap, his arms wrapped securely around her. The flames danced and crackled, filling the cabin with warmth and golden light. Outside, darkness had fallen completely, the sky blazing with more stars than Genevieve had ever imagined existed. "Are you frightened?" Pierce asked quietly. "About tonight?" Genevieve considered the question honestly. "A little," she admitted. "I have never been with a man before, but I trust you." "I will be gentle," he promised. "We will go slowly. If you want to stop at any point, you only have to say so." She turned in his lap to face him, straddling his thighs. The position was bold, but she felt bold, empowered by his love and her own newfound strength. "I do not want to stop," she said. "I want to be your wife in every way." Pierce groaned and pulled her close, his mouth finding hers in a kiss that quickly turned desperate. His hands roamed her body, learning her shape through the fabric of her dress. Genevieve responded with equal passion, her fingers tangling in his long hair, her body pressing against his. He carried her up the ladder to the loft, laying her gently on the bed she had made earlier. The space was cozy, the peaked roof creating an intimate atmosphere. A window at the far end let in moonlight that silvered everything it touched. Pierce undressed her slowly, reverently, his large hands surprisingly dexterous with the tiny buttons of her dress. When she lay before him in only her chemise and stockings, he paused to simply look at her. "You are beautiful," he said, his voice rough with desire. "The most beautiful thing I have ever seen." "I am too thin," Genevieve protested, suddenly self-conscious of her body's frailty. "You are perfect." He shed his own clothes quickly, and Genevieve's breath caught at the sight of him. He was magnificent, all hard muscle and masculine power, exactly as she had imagined during her secret dreams. He joined her on the bed, covering her body with his, and she welcomed his weight, the solid realness of him. What followed was tender and passionate by turns, Pierce keeping his promise to be gentle, but unable to entirely contain the depth of his desire. Genevieve discovered that her body, so recently reawakened to appetite for food, was equally eager for this new hunger. The brief pain of her first time gave way to pleasure that made her cry out, clinging to Pierce as waves of sensation rolled through her. Afterward, they lay tangled together, both breathing hard, covered in a fine sheen of sweat despite the cool night air. Pierce pulled a quilt over them and gathered Genevieve close, her head on his chest, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Sleep now, wife. Tomorrow we begin our life together." Genevieve drifted off with a smile on her face, warmer and more content than she had been since before her world fell apart. She dreamed of mountains and meadows, of golden aspens and clear streams, of a life filled with love and purpose and joy. The weeks that followed established the rhythm of their married life. Pierce tended his trap lines, leaving early each morning to check them, returning by mid-afternoon with whatever he had caught. Genevieve kept the cabin, learning to cook on the fireplace, to preserve meat, to do the 100 small tasks required for survival in the wilderness. She also sewed, creating new clothes for both of them, mending what needed repair, using her skill to contribute to their household. But the greatest joy came at mealtimes. 3 times a day, they sat together at the rough-hewn table, and Pierce continued his habit of giving Genevieve the best cut of whatever they had. When he brought down a deer, she received the tenderest backstrap. When they had rabbit, she got the succulent hindquarter. When he caught fish in the nearby stream, she received the largest, fattest fillet. "You do not need to do this anymore," Genevieve told him one evening as he placed the finest piece of venison on her plate. "I am eating well now. My appetite is strong." "I know," Pierce said, taking his seat beside her. "But I am going to keep doing it anyway. It makes me happy to ensure you are well fed. Humor me." "You are impossible," she said, but she was smiling. "You love me anyway." "I do. God help me, I do." As October gave way to November, the first snows came to the high country. Genevieve woke one morning to find the world transformed, everything covered in pristine white. The mountains gleamed in the sunlight, impossibly beautiful. Pierce stood at the window, already dressed, watching the snow with an expression of satisfaction. "Is this normal?" Genevieve asked, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders as she joined him, earlier than usual but not unexpected. "We will likely be snowed in by mid-December." He glanced at her, gauging her reaction. "Does that worry you?" "No," she said honestly. "As long as I am with you, I do not care if we never see another human being." Pierce pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her from behind. "We will need to make a trip to town before the heavy snows. Stock up on flour, sugar, coffee, things I cannot trap or hunt. Do you feel strong enough for the journey?" Genevieve considered. Her health had improved dramatically since their marriage. She had gained weight, her face filling out to its natural shape. Her energy levels were higher than they had been in over a year. Dr. Marsh would be amazed at her transformation. "I feel strong enough for anything," she declared. They made the journey to Platteville the following week, before the next snowstorm could close the passes. The town was preparing for winter, everyone rushing to complete last-minute tasks. At the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson greeted them with tears of joy, exclaiming over how healthy Genevieve looked. "You have roses in your cheeks," the landlady declared, "and you have put on weight. Oh, Mr. Malone, you have worked miracles." "She has worked the miracle herself," Pierce said. "I just made sure she had the resources to heal." They stayed in town 2 nights, sleeping in Pierce's old room at the boarding house. Mrs. Henderson treated them like visiting royalty, preparing elaborate meals and fussing over their comfort. The other boarders wanted to hear all about life in the mountains, and Genevieve found herself telling stories that would have seemed impossible months ago. Stories of waking to elk grazing outside the cabin window, of watching a mother bear teach her cubs to fish, of nights so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. On their final evening, Mr. Peterson pulled Pierce aside for a private conversation. Genevieve watched from across the room as the older man spoke earnestly, Pierce nodding and occasionally responding. When Pierce returned to her side, he looked thoughtful. "What was that about?" she asked. "He wanted to thank me for showing him that it is never too late to change. He said watching me care for you inspired him to be more attentive to Miss Martha. They are courting now, apparently. That is wonderful. He also said something else." Pierce took her hand, his expression serious. "He said that sometimes one act of kindness can ripple outward in ways we never anticipate. That by saving you, I may have reminded the whole town about the importance of caring for one another. Genevieve felt tears prick her eyes. You did save me. In every way a person can be saved. They returned to the mountains laden with supplies, reaching the cabin just as the next major snowstorm began. For the next 3 months, they were effectively cut off from the outside world. Snow piled high against the cabin walls. The temperature plummeted. Some mornings, Genevieve could see her breath inside the cabin until Pierce got the fire roaring. But she was not scared or lonely. Pierce had laid in ample supplies of firewood, food, and everything else they needed. They were warm, well-fed, and together. The isolation that might have driven some people mad felt like a gift to Genevieve, this time carved out of the world where nothing existed except the two of them. They fell into a comfortable routine. Pierce still checked his trap lines when the weather permitted, sometimes gone for hours trudging through deep snow. Genevieve kept the cabin warm, cooked their meals, and worked on her sewing projects. She made Pierce a new shirt, embroidering his initials on the pocket. She created curtains for the windows, fashioned from fabric they had purchased in town. She even began a quilt, piecing together scraps in a pattern her mother had taught her years ago. The evenings were their favorite time. After supper, they would sit before the fire, Genevieve reading aloud from books, while Pierce carved or repaired equipment. Sometimes they simply talked, sharing their pasts, their dreams, their thoughts on everything from philosophy to the best way to cook beans. And sometimes they forgot about reading and talking entirely, losing themselves in each other's arms, their passion burning hotter than the fire. By January, Genevieve knew she was pregnant. Her monthly bleeding had not come, her breasts were tender, and she felt a peculiar queasiness in the mornings. She said nothing at first, wanting to be certain before sharing the news. But as the signs became undeniable, she knew she had to tell Pierce. She chose a snowy afternoon when they were both in the cabin, the world outside a swirl of white. Pierce was at the table, cleaning his rifle, the pieces laid out with military precision. Genevieve approached him from behind and wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "I have something to tell you," she said softly. Pierce set down the rifle barrel he had been inspecting and turned to look at her. "What is it?" "I am with child." For a moment, Pierce simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then his face broke into the most brilliant smile she had ever seen. He stood so abruptly, his chair fell backward with a crash. He picked Genevieve up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy. "Are you certain?" he asked, setting her gently on her feet. "As certain as I can be without a doctor's confirmation. But yes, I am certain." Pierce dropped to his knees and pressed his face against her still flat stomach. "I am going to be a father," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a child." "Are you happy?" Genevieve asked, running her fingers through his hair. Happy does not begin to describe it. He looked up at her, and she saw tears glistening in his storm-gray eyes. "You have given me everything, Genevieve. A reason to live, a purpose beyond mere survival, and now a family. I do not deserve you. But I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of these gifts." "You deserve all of it and more," she said, pulling him to his feet so she could kiss him. "You are the best man I have ever known, Pierce Malone. Our child is lucky to have you as a father." The rest of the winter took on a new quality, a sense of anticipation that colored everything they did. Pierce became even more protective, insisting Genevieve rest more, eat more, avoid any task that might be too strenuous. She tolerated his hovering with good humor, understanding it came from love rather than a belief in her fragility. "I am pregnant, not dying," she reminded him one afternoon when he tried to prevent her from carrying a bucket of water from the well. "I know, but humor me. I cannot help wanting to protect you both." "You do protect us. Every day, in 100 ways." She took his hand and placed it on her stomach. "Do you feel that? That is your child, growing strong because of the life you have built for us here." Pierce's expression softened, and he pulled her close, cradling her against his chest. "I love you so much it frightens me sometimes. The thought of anything happening to you or the baby." "Nothing will happen. We are safe here, safe with you." As winter began to loosen its grip and February arrived, they started planning for the future. They would need to expand the cabin before the baby came, adding a separate room for the child. They would need a cradle, baby clothes, diapers, and all the other necessities for an infant. Pierce made lists, his practical nature coming to the fore. "We will go to town as soon as the pass is clear," he said. "See Dr. Marsh, make sure everything is progressing well. Buy what we need. And tell everyone our news," Genevieve added. "Mrs. Henderson will be beside herself with excitement." They made the journey to Platteville in late March, when the snow had melted enough to make the trail passable. The town was emerging from its winter hibernation, people venturing out to enjoy the warmer weather. At the boarding house, they received a hero's welcome. Mrs. Henderson cried when she heard about the baby. Miss Martha and Mr. Peterson, now openly courting, offered their congratulations. Even young Timothy seemed pleased, though he blushed furiously when Mrs. Henderson suggested he might want to start looking for a wife of his own. Dr. Marsh examined Genevieve and pronounced her in excellent health. "I would never have believed it if I had not seen it with my own eyes," he said, shaking his head in wonder. "Last fall you were at death's door. Now you are thriving, with a healthy child on the way. It is remarkable." "I had good care," Genevieve said, smiling at Pierce. "Indeed you did." The doctor turned to Pierce. "You will need to bring her back to town when her time draws near. Childbirth is unpredictable, and it would be wise to have me nearby in case of complications." "We will come in August," Pierce agreed. "Stay through the birth and for however long afterward is necessary." They spent a week in Platteville, purchasing supplies and visiting with the friends they had made. On their last evening, Mrs. Henderson hosted a dinner in their honor, inviting half the town. The dining room overflowed with well-wishers, all eager to see the couple who had become something of a local legend. As they ate, Pierce performed his customary ritual, selecting the finest slice of ham from the platter and placing it on Genevieve's plate. The gesture, which had once drawn curious stares, now brought knowing smiles from everyone present. It had become part of their story, this mountain man who ensured his wife always received the best cut. "To Pierce and Genevieve," Mr. Peterson said, raising his glass. "May their love continue to inspire us all." "To Pierce and Genevieve," the room echoed. Genevieve blinked back tears and squeezed Pierce's hand under the table. How far they had both come from that first evening when he had walked into the boarding house dining room and seen her wasting away. How much had changed in such a short time. They returned to the mountains as April bloomed across the high country. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in waves of color. The aspens leafed out, their new growth a brilliant green. The streams ran high with snowmelt, and wildlife was everywhere. Pierce began working on the addition to the cabin, cutting and hauling logs, shaping them to fit. Genevieve helped where she could, though Pierce limited her to light tasks like chinking the gaps between logs with clay. As summer arrived and Genevieve's belly swelled with their growing child, they spent long evenings on the porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Pierce would place his hand on her stomach, feeling the baby kick and move. They talked about names, about what kind of parents they wanted to be, about the future they were building together. "I want our child to know both worlds," Genevieve said one evening. "The mountains and the town, the wilderness and civilization. I want them to be comfortable anywhere." "That sounds wise," Pierce agreed. "We will split our time. Winter's here, where I can trap and we can enjoy the solitude. Summers in town or somewhere nearby, where the child can attend school and socialize with other children." "You would do that? Leave the mountains for months at a time?" "For you and our child, I would do anything." They made the journey back to Platteville in August, when Genevieve was in her final month of pregnancy. Dr. Marsh had made arrangements for her to stay in a room near his office, where he could monitor her condition closely. Pierce took a room at the boarding house, but spent most of his time at Genevieve's side, reluctant to leave her even for a few hours. The baby came on a hot August night, just as a thunderstorm rolled through the valley. Genevieve's labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours. Pierce paced outside the room where Dr. Marsh and Mrs. Henderson attended her, his face drawn with worry. Every cry of pain from behind the closed door felt like a knife in his chest. Finally, just before dawn, a new sound pierced the air. The thin, outraged wail of a newborn baby. Pierce's heart seemed to stop, then start again, beating wildly. The door opened, and Mrs. Henderson emerged, her face wreathed in smiles. "You have a son," she announced. "A healthy, beautiful boy, and your wife is doing well." Pierce pushed past her into the room. Genevieve lay in the bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in a white blanket. Dr. Marsh was cleaning up, packing away his instruments. When Genevieve saw Pierce, her face lit up. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Pierce approached the bed on unsteady legs. He looked down at the tiny face peeking out from the blanket and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn gray like his father's. He was perfect. Absolutely perfect. "Can I hold him?" Pierce asked, his voice hoarse. "Of course." Genevieve carefully transferred the baby into Pierce's large hands. The infant looked impossibly small, cradled in his father's arms. But Pierce held him with surprising confidence, as though he had been doing it all his life. "Hello, son," Pierce whispered. "I am your father. I am going to take care of you and your mother. I am going to make sure you always have what you need. I am going to teach you to be strong and kind and honest. I am going to love you with everything I have." The baby made a small sound, almost like a sigh, and settled into his father's arms. Genevieve watched through happy tears, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "What should we name him?" Pierce asked, looking up from the baby's face. "I was thinking Paul," Genevieve said. "Paul Henderson Malone, after the landlady who brought us together." "Paul Henderson Malone," Pierce repeated, testing the name. "It is perfect." Mrs. Henderson, who had been hovering in the doorway, burst into fresh tears. "You are naming him after me." "You gave us both a home when we needed one," Genevieve said. "It seems fitting that our son should carry your name." They stayed in Platteville for a month after Paul's birth, giving Genevieve time to recover and the baby time to grow stronger before the journey to the mountains. The townspeople showered them with gifts. Clothes, blankets, a beautiful cradle that Mr. Peterson had built himself. Miss Martha knitted an entire layette of tiny garments. Young Timothy, now 19 and still unmarried, carved a set of wooden toys. When they finally made the journey home in late September, fall had returned to the high country. The aspens blazed gold once more, and the air carried that crisp edge that promised winter was not far behind. But this time, they traveled as a family, Paul bundled warmly and sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. The cabin welcomed them back, the new addition complete and waiting. Pierce had fashioned a beautiful cradle from pine, sanding it until it was smooth as silk. He had also built shelves for baby supplies and a comfortable rocking chair where Genevieve could nurse. Everything was ready for their new life as parents. The first few months were exhausting, Paul waking frequently to nurse, both parents stumbling through their days in a fog of sleep deprivation. But they were happy, deliriously happy, watching their son grow and change daily. Pierce proved to be a devoted father, taking over the baby's care whenever Genevieve needed rest. He learned to change diapers, to walk the floor at 3 a.m, soothing a fussy infant, to make silly faces that brought gummy smiles to Paul's face. And at every meal, Pierce continued his tradition. As Genevieve nursed Paul, Pierce would prepare food, always ensuring she received the best portions. "You are feeding him," he said when she protested that she did not need special treatment. "You need your strength, so humor me." The years that followed were full and rich. Paul grew from infant to toddler to boy, learning to walk and talk and eventually to help with simple chores. Pierce taught him about the mountains, how to read tracks, how to move quietly through the forest, how to respect the land and the animals that lived there. Genevieve taught him letters and numbers, read to him from her cherished books, showed him how to sew simple stitches. They kept their promise to split time between the mountains and civilization. Every spring they would journey to Platteville, staying through the summer so Paul could attend school and socialize with other children. Then, in the fall, they would return to the mountains for the winter, living the life that Pierce loved and that Genevieve had come to treasure. When Paul was 4, they had a second child, a daughter they named Grace. She was born at the cabin, attended by Pierce and a midwife they had hired to stay with them for the final month of Genevieve's pregnancy. Grace had her mother's gray eyes and her father's dark hair, and from the moment she arrived, she wrapped everyone around her tiny finger. 2 years after Grace came another son, Samuel. Then 3 years later, twin girls, Rose and Lily. The cabin grew along with the family, Pierce adding rooms and a second story to accommodate everyone. What had started as a bachelor's simple dwelling became a real home, filled with laughter and love, and the chaos of 5 children. Through it all, Pierce never stopped his ritual. At every meal, no matter how busy or tired he was, he made sure Genevieve received the best cut of whatever they were eating. The children grew up watching this, learning from their father's example what it meant to truly care for someone. When Paul was old enough to help prepare meals, he began imitating Pierce, giving his mother choice portions with a solemnity that made both parents want to laugh and cry at the same time. "You do not need to do that," Genevieve told her son one evening, as she had once told Pierce. "But Papa does it," Paul said simply. "He says you always deserve the best because you are the heart of our family." Genevieve looked across the table at Pierce, who shrugged with a small smile. After more than a decade of marriage, she still felt that flutter in her chest when he looked at her. Still felt that sense of wonder that this life was hers. The children grew and thrived. Paul, steady and responsible, became a skilled tracker like his father. Grace, creative and bold, showed talent for drawing and painting. Samuel, quiet and thoughtful, loved books as much as his mother. The twins, Rose and Lily, were mirror images of each other, but with opposite personalities. Rose adventurous and reckless, Lily cautious and sweet. As the children entered their teenage years, Pierce and Genevieve began planning for the next phase of their lives. Paul expressed interest in becoming a surveyor, mapping the expanding Western territories. Grace wanted to study art in Denver. Samuel dreamed of attending college back east. The twins were still young enough that their futures remained wide open. "We raised them well," Pierce said one evening as he and Genevieve sat on the porch, watching the sun set. The children were inside, arguing good-naturedly over who had to do the dishes. "They are strong and capable and kind." "They had a good example," Genevieve replied, leaning her head on his shoulder. "You have been an amazing father, Pierce, and an amazing husband." "I simply followed the lesson you taught me from the very beginning." "What lesson was that?" "That sometimes the most important thing we can do is make sure the people we love have what they need to survive and thrive." He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You needed someone to care whether you ate, to give you the best cut, to remind you that life was worth living. And in caring for you, I found my own purpose, my own reason to thrive." Genevieve turned to look at him, this man who had saved her life in every way possible. "Do you remember the first time you saw me?" "Every detail. You were sitting at the dining table, thin as a rail, pushing food around your plate. The other boarders were joking about how you ate like a bird. And I looked at you and thought, this woman is dying, and no one is doing anything to stop it. And you decided to be the one who stopped it. I decided to try. I had no idea if it would work, no idea if you would let me help, but I had to try. I am so glad you did." She kissed him softly, a kiss filled with years of love and gratitude and partnership. "You gave me back my life. You gave me a family, a home, a future I never thought I would have." "We gave those things to each other," Pierce corrected. "You taught me that living and surviving are not the same thing. That a life alone, no matter how self-sufficient, is still a half-life. You taught me about love and family, and the courage it takes to open your heart after loss." They sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged in the vast Montana sky. From inside came the sounds of their children finishing the dishes, their voices raised in song. The twins were giggling about something. Grace was scolding Samuel for leaving his books on the kitchen table again. Paul's deeper voice, so like his father's, was trying to restore order. "This is what I want to remember," Genevieve said softly. "This moment, right here. Our children healthy and happy. You beside me. The mountains watching over us. This is the life I almost did not live. The joy I almost missed because I was too broken to see a future. Thank you for showing me that future was possible." Pierce kissed the top of her head. "Thank you for being brave enough to take it. For eating that first piece of meat I gave you. For saying yes when I asked you to marry me. For following me to these mountains and building this life with me. You are the strongest person I have ever known. Genevieve Malone." As the years continued to pass, their children one by one left the nest to pursue their own dreams. Paul became a respected surveyor, mapping territories across the West. He married a school teacher named Sarah and gave Pierce and Genevieve their first grandchild, a boy they named Pierce after his grandfather. Grace attended art school in Denver and eventually opened her own gallery, her paintings of mountain landscapes becoming sought after by collectors. Samuel went to college in Boston and became a teacher, returning west every summer to spend time with his family. The twins took longer to find their paths. Rose briefly worked in a saloon as a singer, giving her parents heart attacks before she met and married a rancher and settled down to raise horses. Lily became a nurse, inspired by Dr. Marsh, who had delivered all 5 siblings. She worked at the hospital in Denver, but visited the cabin often, claiming the mountain air cleared her head. Through all these changes, Pierce and Genevieve remained constants in each other's lives. They grew older together, silver threading through Pierce's dark hair, lines deepening around Genevieve's eyes. But their love never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger, tempered by decades of partnership and devotion. Pierce never stopped giving Genevieve the best cut at meals. Even when they were grandparents, even when their children teased them about the old-fashioned ritual, he persisted. It had become such a part of their routine that Genevieve barely noticed it anymore, simply accepting the choice portions he placed on her plate as her due. But one evening, when they were both in their 60s, Genevieve put down her fork and looked across the table at her husband. "Do you know what I realized today?" she asked. "What is that?" "It has been exactly 40 years since the first time you gave me the best cut of meat. 40 years since you walked into that boarding house dining room and changed my life forever." Pierce smiled, that same smile that had made her heart flutter 4 decades ago. "Has it really been that long?" "It has. And you have been giving me the best cut at every meal since." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Do you know what that means?" "What?" "Assuming 3 meals a day for 40 years, that is roughly 43,000 meals. 43,000 times you have put my needs above your own. 43,000 small acts of love." Pierce looked down at their joined hands, both wrinkled now, but still fitting together perfectly. "I never thought of it as sacrifice. It was simply ensuring you had what you needed." "I know, and that is what makes it so beautiful. You never saw it as a burden or an obligation. It was just what you did, what you have always done, because you love me." "I do love you," Pierce said seriously. "More now than on the day we married, which I would not have thought possible. You are everything to me, Genevieve. You always have been." She stood and moved around the table to sit in his lap, something she had not done in years, but which felt absolutely right in this moment. He wrapped his arms around her, and she laid her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, unchanged despite the passage of time. "We have had a good life," she murmured. "The best life," he agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. Do you have any regrets?" Pierce was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. "Only one," he said finally. "I regret that I could not have met you sooner, that you had to suffer through your parents' death and your illness alone. I wish I could have been there to help you through that darkness. But then our meeting would not have been what it was. We might not have recognized each other, might not have needed each other in the same way." Genevieve lifted her head to look at him. "I think we found each other exactly when we were supposed to, when we were both ready to be found." "You are probably right. You usually are." She laughed and kissed him, tasting like the apple pie they had just finished for dessert. "I love you, Pierce Malone. Thank you for 40 years of the best cuts. Thank you for saving my life. Thank you for this family, this home, this beautiful life we built together." "Thank you for letting me," he replied, "for taking a chance on a rough mountain man who had no idea what he was doing, but who knew he could not let you slip away." They sat together as evening deepened into night, comfortable in the silence that only comes from decades of companionship. The cabin was quiet, their children scattered across the territory pursuing their own lives. But it was a good quiet, full of memories and love, and the certainty that they had done well by each other and by their family. As Genevieve drifted into a light doze in Pierce's arms, she thought about the girl she had been at 22, wasting away in a boarding house in Platteville, convinced her life was over. She thought about the mountain man who had looked at her and decided she was worth saving. She thought about the love they had built, the family they had raised, the life they had created together in these mountains. And she smiled, knowing that of all the cuts of meat she had eaten in her life, the most tender and precious had always been the love Pierce had given her so freely, so completely, for 40 years and counting. The years continued to pass, each season bringing new joys and challenges. More grandchildren arrived, 10 in total, each one bringing fresh energy and laughter to family gatherings. Pierce and Genevieve became pillars of the community, respected for their enduring marriage and the family they had raised. Their story became local legend, told and retold, embellished and romanticized until sometimes they barely recognized themselves in the tales. But the heart of the story remained true. A dying young woman, a mountain man who refused to let her give up, and a love that had sustained them both through 4 decades of life's inevitable ups and downs. When Pierce was 70 and Genevieve 68, they decided to make one final journey to the cabin where they had spent so many happy winters. Their children protested, worried about the difficulty of the trip at their age. But Pierce and Genevieve insisted. They wanted to see the mountains one more time, to walk the familiar paths, to sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the peaks where they had built their life together. The journey took longer than it once had, with frequent stops to rest. But eventually, they arrived, finding the cabin exactly as they had left it, maintained by Paul and his sons who used it for hunting trips. Everything was clean and ready. Firewood stacked on the porch, the pantry stocked with supplies. They spent a week there, just the two of them, reliving memories and creating new ones. They walked slowly through the meadow where Grace had picked her first wildflowers. They visited the stream where Samuel had learned to fish. They stood beneath the tree where they had carved their initials 42 years ago. The letters now weathered, but still visible. On their last evening, Pierce prepared supper, a simple meal of stew and bread. When he served Genevieve, he made sure to give her the most tender pieces of meat, the ritual as natural and automatic as breathing. She smiled at him across the table, her gray eyes still bright despite the passage of years. "Still making sure I get the best cut," she said softly. "Always," he replied, "until my last breath. And I will love you until mine." They ate slowly, savoring not just the food, but the moment, the precious gift of shared time. After supper, they sat on the porch as they had so many times before, wrapped in blankets against the cool mountain air, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "If I could go back and change anything," Genevieve said thoughtfully, "I would not. Every moment, every choice, every joy and sorrow led us here, to this life, to this love. I would not trade a single second of it." "Neither would I," Pierce agreed. He pulled her closer, and she nestled against him, fitting perfectly as she always had. "You have been my everything, Genevieve. My purpose, my joy, my reason for waking up each morning. Saving your life that day in the boarding house was the most important thing I have ever done." "You did not just save my life," she corrected gently. "You taught me how to live it. There is a difference, and it is everything." They sat together until the cold drove them inside, then climbed to the loft where they had shared their first night as husband and wife. The bed was the same, though the mattress had been replaced countless times. They lay down together, Pierce curving his body around Genevieve's, holding her close. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," he replied. "Always and forever." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, surrounded by 4 decades of love and memories, secure in the knowledge that they had lived well and loved completely. They returned to town the following week, to the house they had purchased years ago to be closer to their children and grandchildren. Life resumed its gentle rhythm, quieter now, but no less precious. They attended church on Sundays, hosted family dinners every month, watched their grandchildren grow and begin families of their own. And at every meal, every single meal until the very end, Pierce made sure Genevieve received the best cut. It was not duty or obligation, but pure love, expressed through the simple act of ensuring his wife had the finest of everything he could provide. When Pierce died at 75, passing peacefully in his sleep, Genevieve grieved deeply, but without regret. They had been given 45 years together, a lifetime of love and partnership. Their children and grandchildren surrounded her, offering comfort and support. But the thing that sustained her most was the certainty that Pierce had lived the life he wanted, loving the woman he chose, building the family he dreamed of. At the funeral, Paul spoke about his father's legacy, but he did not talk about Pierce's skill as a trapper or his strength or his knowledge of the wilderness. Instead, he talked about the best cut. "My father taught us all what love looks like," Paul said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is not grand gestures or flowery words. It is 45 years of making sure the woman you love has the best cut of meat. It is 45 years of small, daily acts of devotion. It is choosing, over and over again, to put someone else's needs above your own. That was my father's greatest lesson, and I hope we all learned it well." Genevieve lived another 8 years after Pierce's death, surrounded by her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She never remarried, never even considered it. How could she, when she had experienced the kind of love most people only read about in books? But something began to happen at family dinners. Paul would place the best piece of roast on Genevieve's plate. Samuel would give her the choicest vegetables. Grace would reserve the finest slice of pie for her mother. The twins would compete to bring her the freshest bread. Even the grandchildren joined in, each one trying to ensure their grandmother had the best of everything. The tradition Pierce had started continued, rippling outward through the family he had built, teaching generations the power of small, consistent acts of love. When Genevieve died at 76, peacefully in her sleep, she was buried beside Pierce in the cemetery overlooking Platteville. Their joint headstone read simply, "Pierce Malone, 1844-1919 Genevieve Dalton Malone, 1854-1930. He made sure she always got the best cut. She made sure he always knew he was loved." Their 5 children, 19 grandchildren, and 31 great-grandchildren attended the funeral. The service was beautiful, full of stories and laughter and tears. But the most moving moment came at the reception afterward, held in the church hall. The family had prepared a feast, and as people filled their plates, something remarkable happened. Without discussion or planning, everyone began making sure those around them received the best portions. Husbands served their wives the finest cuts. Parents gave their children the choicest pieces. Siblings looked out for each other. Friends took care of friends. The gesture, so simple yet so profound, would have made both Pierce and Genevieve smile. They had started with nothing but each other. two broken souls who found healing in love. And from that foundation, they had built something that would endure for generations. A legacy not of wealth or fame, but of devotion and care, and the simple act of ensuring those you love have the best cut. In the years that followed, the story of Pierce and Genevieve became part of family lore, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. Great-grandchildren who had never met them knew about the mountain man who had saved a dying woman by giving her the best cut of meat. They knew about the love that had sustained them through 45 years of marriage. They knew about the family that had been built on a foundation of daily, devoted care. And at tables across Colorado and beyond, the tradition continued. Sons gave their wives the tenderest portions. Daughters made sure their children had the finest pieces. The best cut became synonymous with love itself, a tangible expression of care that transcended words. Pierce and Genevieve had been gone from this world for decades, but their love remained, living on in the lives they had touched and the family they had raised. They had proven that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest meaning, that love is not found in grand pronouncements, but in consistent, daily devotion. They had lived well, loved deeply, and left behind a legacy that would endure long after the mountains they had called home had worn down to hills. And that was more than most people could ever hope for. A life well lived and a love that would never truly die. The story of the mountain man, who made sure his wife always got the best cut, had become more than just a story. It had become a testament to the power of love, the importance of care, and the truth that sometimes saving someone else is the same as saving yourself. Pierce and Genevieve had found each other when both needed saving. And together they had built something beautiful, something lasting, something worth remembering. And in the end, that was the best cut of all.